This is Angela Cozine, and today I am going to be talking to you about the First Amendment, specifically the section that talks about the freedom of the press. Now, I believe that this section is a very important one that the Founding Fathers included in the First Amendment. And the reason for this is that the press, the media, is an extremely critical institution in our country. They inform us of events that take place that are outside of our immediate vicinity. They help us to form opinions about the goings-on in Washington, in other states besides ours, and in other parts of the world. And being well-informed is one of the hallmarks of being a good citizen. And the press are saddled with that responsibility. Now, the First Amendment reads, here, let me pull it up, like as follows. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Alright, and they included that freedom of the press part for very specific reasons, I feel. I did a research paper on my last class that I took, American Colonial History, and part of my paper included some detail about the different newspapers that were in colonial America and how the king and the royal governors tried to take away the licenses of papers that were printing articles that said things against them. And I believe that James Madison had these official attempts to silence public opinion in mind when he wrote that freedom of the press part into the First Amendment. Now, this is a very, like I said, this is a very interesting thing, especially because less than a decade, this came into question, this clause of freedom of the press. And I'm talking, of course, of the Sedition Acts of 1798. And they were passed by the Adams administration. They were there was a piece of legislation that prohibited the press from printing libelous articles or think pieces about people in the government. And libel was really defined as telling a lie with the intent to slander or to bring down someone's reputation. But the problem with the Sedition Acts is that definition of truth was a very narrow one. It wasn't, or rather I should say it was a broad one. And there was a lot of what the Democratic Republicans, they were very critical of this piece of legislation, they thought was unnecessary censorship through this law. The law expired in 1801 after John Adams was out of office, and those who were still serving sentences or having to pay fines under those acts were pardoned, and many were reimbursed for whatever fines they paid. Now, not long after this, there was a critical court case involving, it was called the People versus Croswell. Now, there was a man named Harry Croswell who was convicted of libel for printing a story that was critical of President Thomas Jefferson in his newspaper. Now, Croswell appealed his case. Alexander Hamilton represented him and argued that truth should be a defense for libel. He was basically saying that if what this man said was true, he should not be charged with libel. Croswell ended up losing his case. He was still convicted. But after this, New York changed their law to protect people telling the truth from charges of libel. And you see that throughout all of our history, where the press has been charged, their highest order is telling the truth, telling what is really going on and not lying necessarily about it. Now, this obviously has gone all over the place, and a time in our history that I find particularly interesting as far as the press goes, is the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. It's, like I said, there's really two sides of the coin there. There's, on one side, there's Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst using yellow journalism. They're deliberately sensationalized, exaggerated, and in some cases, outright false stories in order to sell their papers. And this yellow journalism did quite a bit of damage in that day. Probably the most notable example would be a lot of people point to this yellow journalism as the U.S. getting involved in the Spanish-American War. And then on the other side, during the Gilded Age, you had the muckrakers, the journalists who risked everything and went deep undercover to uncover corruption in the government, in big business, basically in the people who had power, and really who had the power to damage them if they were to reveal this information, but they did anyway. So it's really a very, like I said, a very interesting time in our history as far as the press goes. And it's very reminiscent, I think, well, at least what I'm saying is what we're going through today is kind of reminiscent of that time. There has recently been a very large concern with what the media has dubbed fake news. Sources on the internet that do not name their sources, that print exaggerations, that maybe sometimes print outright lies, and do so to spread rumors, to circulate misinformation, and people believe it. And I think this is, I'm interested to see where the country is going to go as a result of this, because it's really never been more apparent than now that we're working with this new medium that we have little to no idea what the potential of it was until now. And I'm interested to see where the country is going to go with this, what kinds of legislation are going to be passed to ensure the sanctity of journalism and the upholding of the truth. So, again, very, very interesting, very complex thing, and it really all goes back to this section of the First Amendment that talks about the freedom of the press.